Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960 AM. I met a guy by the name of Nadeem Naithoo, who was one of these really bright consultants at McKinsey, and he gave it all up to launch a after-school kind of business, school for kids. And I went to visit him downtown Toronto before COVID-19 hit, and was absolutely fascinating with the caliber of his students, with the caliber of the teaching, and with what they were doing to really transform lives. So I wanted to find out a little bit more about his company. So Nadeem, how are you? Welcome to my show.
I'm doing well, man. Thanks for having me.
So tell me about both what your school is and what it's trying to do and how you got into it.
Yeah, so let me start with the why we started TKS. I mean, our purpose was to maximize the impact that we can have on the world. And at McKinsey, I mean, it was an interesting experience. And, I was working with CEOs around the world, but it wasn't quite tracking to that goal that I was talking about. And so we also did a lot of development work in places like Bangladesh. We worked with the Grameen Bank and Mohammed Yunus, who is the founder of microfinance, Nobel Peace Prize winner. We were in Tajikistan building early childhood development centers, Kyrgyzstan helping build a $250 million university, East Africa, Honduras. And when I say we, I mean my brother and I. And we were doing these things because we thought that they were really impactful and we could help a lot. But while we were there, we realized that we were having kind of this one-to-one impact. And this is the first time in human history where people can impact billions at scale. So 1,000 years ago, if you wanted to impact billions, you had to be like a Conqueror or Galileo or even an Einstein. You almost had to die for your teachings or impact to propagate throughout history. Whereas today, anybody who has a device, you can write a couple lines of code and give financial literacy to everybody or build mobile wallets for the unbanked. The infrastructure is there. But what we found is that there's not as many people as there should be taking up this infrastructure to solve really important problems. There's a lot of people taking up this infrastructure to start Uber for bartenders and Yelp for dog food, right? And that's what we saw when we moved down to Silicon Valley. My brother started an AI company that got acquired by Box.com, and he was leading their AI and machine learning team for a multi-billion-dollar company. And keep in mind, he had no technical background. When he started, he didn't even know the difference between a designer and developer. 4 years later, he's the head of AI at a multi-billion-dollar company. And even in that position, we were thinking that we could do a lot more. And so we thought about it and we asked ourselves this question: what if we had $10 billion in the bank? How do we spend our time? And there were three problems.
This is you and your brother just sitting down one day saying, what if we had $10 billion?
We were eating ice cream at a Cold Stone in Mountain View, California. And we just asked the question, like, what do we want? Say there was no BS, right? Say there was like no financial constraints, like we had made it, we had influence, whatever. Then how would we spend the time? Forget about this rat race. And there were three problems that we wanted to solve. So the first was affordable housing. The second was food production, like the Impossible Foods, Soylent, vertical farming. People might have heard of these terms. And then the third was access to diagnostics and drugs. And we're like, say we dedicate the rest of our lives to solve one of these problems, and say we knocked it out of the park. What about these hundreds of other problems that are impacting billions? Well, it feels like our current strategy as a civilization is to cross our fingers, hold our breath, and hope that someone will come along to solve these problems, like Elon Musk will save the day. Whereas to us, that's felt like a non-strategy. So I'm giving a long-winded answer for why we started TKS, but at the end of the day, there's no institution in the world that we can think of that's training people specifically to solve really important problems in the world. Like, say the Olympics didn't exist. How many 13 and 14-year-olds would wake up and say, you know what, I want to dedicate the rest of my life to being super fast in the water? Very few people, I think, would do that. But the Olympics provides the infrastructure, the intention, the economic incentive, whatever. The interesting thing is we do have 13 and 14-year-olds wake up today, be like, I want to change the world. I want to have a lot of impact. I want to create the future. But then they're 22, 23 sitting at a desk as an accountant. No shade to accountants, right? But if they wanted to do that, then it's like, what the heck happened? And so we decided to develop this infrastructure, this institution. That's not, building infrastructure isn't often sexy, and especially working in education, because we could have been working on self-flying cars right now. We could be working on quantum computers and like all this exciting stuff. But we thought that building the infrastructure is really important. So that's the why behind TKS. And then 3.5, 4 years later, seeing some pretty incredible results. So we're a 10-month program after school. It's meant to be your number one priority outside of school. It's almost like if you wanted to play for the NHL, for example, oftentimes you'll go to a sports school and you'll build your school around your sports. Well, TKS is meant to be that for if you wanted to be an Olympic level CEO, innovator, thought leader, researcher. So we get in young people between the ages of 13 to 17 who have the potential that we try and identify, and we train them on pretty much how to be a superpowered version of themselves. I'm going to shut up.
TKS stands for?
The Knowledge Society.
The Knowledge Society. We're chatting with Nadeem Naithoo. We're going to take a break for some messages and come right back. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We're chatting tonight with Nadeem Naithoo, who is one of the co-founders of TKS, a school after school for kids that are going to change the world. Nadeem, I was in your school one Saturday, and the kids were brilliant, unbelievably articulate. Do you just train the people that are going to be stars anyway?
So they definitely don't come in this way. And I think you chatted to a couple of them when you were there. Again, all we look for, there is an application and an interview process, but we don't look at grades. We don't look at age. We don't look at school, any of that stuff. We don't even look at what they built. Like a 13-year-old, what are they going to have accomplished? And so what we do care about is, do you have curiosity, and are you driven? And really, that's all you need to be a part of the program. So we have many stories. I think Isha, who you talked to, she talked about not even knowing how to code, didn't even think she would be interested in tech. Fast forward, she's a machine learning developer. We had Isabella join TKS. She didn't even know what the word software was. A year and a half later, she's speaking in front of 50,000 people in the T-Mobile Arena in Las Vegas, working with the founder of Lab Grown Meat down in Amsterdam, getting a bunch of really interesting opportunities. And so it is really meant to be a transformative experience. I think there's too many filtering organizations in the world, like companies and universities. They're all filtering organizations, and I think it has their place. I think Life is probably the best human development organization right now, but it's too unstructured, very serendipitous. And so part of our goal is, how do we structure the serendipity, right? How do we bring in students who have potential and then maximize the probability that they'll achieve that potential, if that makes sense?
So, my perception is you really did two things, probably far more, but one is you really worked on their skill base in coding and computers and technology. And then the second is their personality, their character, their ability to speak, their curiosity, their driven desire to make change in the world. How do you do those two different things?
So what's interesting is that when people ask us about the program, so let's talk about something like design thinking. People might have heard that term as a way to solve problems. Some people might ask our students, do you do design thinking? And they'll say, I don't know, what is that? And then they'll say what it is, and they'll be like, oh, isn't that the only way to solve problems, right? And so we really try and focus on project-based learning. So you learn by doing, and you're working with teams, and you're working on really hard problems. And when you think about how to build character, in my opinion, it's about having the right goals and intentions. So being intentional about the things that you want to work on, and then putting yourselves in environments where you can actually do the thing and work on it. So say, for example, you want to be resilient. Say you want to be an amazing problem solver. Say you want to be helpful. Say you want to be kind. Well, you got to put yourself in those environments to do all those things. And then on the technical side, say you want to build something really impactful, and say you want to build your technical depth. Well, how can you marry those things together? So they're not two separate things, but you're actually working on solving a hard problem, and you need both the mindsets, character, and the skills and exposure and technologies to be able to do that. It's not a one thing or another. That's the approach we take to it.
So are you telling me that these kids that are doing machine learning and artificial intelligence, you're not actually teaching them the coding, they're teaching it themselves in teams?
Yeah, so what we do is, here's the school approach. The school approach is like, here's a wrench, here's a screwdriver, you get to grade 12, and it's like, now figure out why this was important. Whereas for us, it doesn't really make much sense to do it that way. We say, okay, here's an engine. Here's why an engine's important. Now let's take apart this engine. Here's what you need a screwdriver for. Here's what you need a wrench for. And then once you understand the why you're doing what you're doing, once you set a project that you want to build, now it's up to you to figure out how to be resourceful and use a lot of these tools that are available to get started. So we won't spoon feed anyone at TKS. And then say they get to a point where they just need that extra help. They need to get into a lab. They need to talk to an expert. they need a certain software that costs $200,000. Like in the case of Ben, when he was disrupting MRIs, he needed a simulation software and it was really difficult to get. That's when we take them to the next level. But to get from 0 to 1, there is enough information. We live in such an abundance era right now where content is king. 20 years ago, when I grew up, there were cat videos on YouTube, right? There was no Khan Academy. There was no Udacity or Lambda School or any of these things. Now it's in abundance. Content is no longer the problem. It's how do we actually get started, hold people accountable, and raise young people's bar for difficulty that, yes, they can actually achieve these things. And it's just about having the right guidance to put in the work.
Now, one of the things that I saw was a smaller group that you took aside, that you were trying to motivate them to be leaders within the class. I can't remember what you called the group, but then you went through a whole sort of description with them, and they were the ones developing the ideas. You were leading it, facilitating it, but they were the ones developing the ideas of what would make a leader within the class.
Yeah, so that program is called Velocity. That's an opt-in program in TKS. So in TKS, there's no homework, there's no grades, no requirements. But if you join Velocity, that's where the directors in the cities give you extra time, meet half an hour before. You're your own community of people who really want to dedicate to become the best version of themselves. And that discussion that you were talking about was building the quote unquote Velocity community. And what type of people do we want involved with that? And I don't think culture is developed from top down. I think it's developed collaboratively. So the top is meant to have these discussions, set the vision, but there's a lot of different organizations that have their culture and values on the wall, but don't necessarily live it. And so we want to make sure that people have buy-in for how to create that culture and then action items on how to act on it. So for us, it really is about these students having a level of agency, having the ability to make important decisions and become the CEO of their own lives far earlier on versus being an employee of their own lives. So they get to have a say on how the culture of TKS looks like versus us being like, this is what it is, now just do it. Because I didn't think that was the most productive way.
What do you mean agency?
So like being able to wake up in the morning and be like, what do I want? What do I want to do today? What are the decisions that I'm making my own? Or is it heavily influenced by other people? Because if you don't feel like you have agency, then you don't really buy into a lot of the decisions that you make. Whereas we want to make sure that these students feel empowered to really feel like that they have control over their own life. And it's not just life is happening to them.
You also use the language CEOs of their own lives rather than employees. Do you think most people are just employees of their own lives?
I think most young people are for sure. Like parents are, and rightfully so. Like I think a lot of parents are CEOs of their kids' lives and the kids are the employees. Whereas what I want, and even when I was in university, there were students who were taking, waiting 3 weeks to take their laundry home back to their parents so they could do it. I mean, you are definitely not the CEO of your own life in that respect. And so how can as early on as possible, you have enough self-awareness and agency that I talked about to become the CEO of your own life and your parents and your close friends be on your board of directors, right? So the choices that you're making are your own, you're introspecting on it, and you don't feel like, again, that life is happening to you. And I do see even like young adults be employees of their own lives still, right? They're slaves to the company, they're slaves to societal standards. And again, how can it truly be you wake up and reflect, what are my values? What are my goals? And am I aligning to that? No. Okay, well, how can I make a change? And then the difference between being a CEO of your own life and employee is who is held accountable. That's the difference, right? If you are living towards other people's standards, you're always going to blame other people. You're going to blame society. You're going to blame the job. You're going to blame everything else. But if you're the CEO of your own life, you're making the decisions. And if nothing changes, that's because you didn't change anything. And I think that's much more of an empowering position to be in.
I think there's a lot of people my age that are the employees of their lives, not the CEO of their lives, frankly.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
So, how did you come to these realizations? Is this something that you realized when you were a teenager? Is this something that your family and parents breeded you with, or what?
So my parents are from East Africa, Tanzania, and Uganda. My dad had a grade 9 education. He was at a time where you had to struggle to survive. You didn't have choice, right? Where there was opportunity, you had to take that opportunity. And what they knew and what I'm very thankful for is they were incredibly supportive. And earlier on in life, they recognized that they didn't have the answers. So they were like, let's just put you in a bunch of stuff. So I used to do anything from gymnastics to piano to basketball, soccer. My parents used to make me go. So I grew up in a Muslim family. My parents used to take me to the Gurudwara or a church or a Mormon temple and go to Christian camp and whatever, just expose you to a lot of stuff and then encourage us to reflect and kind of make our own decisions. And my brother and I both, I think at a very young age, were fairly philosophical. We were thinking about ideas and purpose. And so I think that always stuck with us. And I think thinking about the why behind things and things from a first principle perspective is really important to come up with a lot of these ideas and thinking. So I think we're always like that to some degree, but I think it's just really important to pay attention and introspect and learn from really awesome people. Like Naveed and I studied philosophy as well. So, I mean, we just like thinking about interesting ideas in general.
You studied philosophy at university?
So we both went to Ivy. We went to business school. And the way that program works is you have 2 years to do whatever you want. And as long as you maintain a certain average, then you go to, the best business school in the country. And what most people do is they still do business just in case they don't get in. So they try and mitigate their risk versus optimize success. Naveed and I were like, oh, let's use this as an opportunity to actually learn and explore. And so we studied philosophy and economics, and we did courses like logic and Greek mythology and all this stuff. And to be honest, the content of the school wasn't the exciting part. It was the fact that we could even just have a formal environment where we could talk about these things and think about it. Otherwise, we had to do it on our own time. But it just gives you a sense of what our attitude was towards life. It's like, how can we just explore ideas versus do a thing, right?
I followed somewhat of the same route. I went to Ivy, but I did political science and history prior to going in. I did do the one business course you had to do.
Yeah, exactly. So same thing with us. And as you might know, there's a lot of people who go into BMOS or economics or something like that just in case they don't get in. Whereas I think it's really important. So if I give advice to any young person, it's just to be interesting. It's not to optimize for the university, not to optimize for the job, but it's whenever you have decisions you need to make, your mental model should be what will make you the most interesting person, in my opinion, because all the other stuff will come. It's easy to fall back on the not interesting stuff because that's what everybody else is doing.
What a great attitude. Make yourself the most interesting person. That's kind of fascinating. So let's come back to this velocity group because I was really quite fascinated by it. What are the other things? You said that the culture is collaborative and bottom up, that you're trying to build character, that they were coming up with the principles themselves. What were some of the other characteristics of people that could be part of Velocity?
Well, I mean, Velocity is just about a commitment, right? It's the intention and commitment to be the best version of yourself. So again, when you think about it for first principles, you got to work backward. What does being a best version of yourself look like? To me, it's about being helpful, being kind, dealing with ambiguity, being an amazing problem solver, being able to figure it out and be relentless. And there's a lot more things that I think people should strive to be. But in that sense, it's a lot more intentional. And you have committed to requirements at TKS. And you have committed to everybody else holding you accountable. Because if you're going to be in the Velocity community, you got to be demonstrating week after week that you're at least attempting and you're trying to be the best version of yourself. The thing that I love about TKS is if you think about school and you get a grade, well, the grade reflects the objective level of knowledge that you have on that topic. If you get a 90 in math, you know 90% of the content. That's what it's supposed to be. And it's not relative to anybody else, and it's not even relative to yourself. It's relative to the bar. For us, people are born different. People come in different. Some people join the TKS at 13, some people join at 16. What's really important for us is to measure you against yourself every week. So every week, are you becoming a better version of yourself? Because people put in different hours and have different intentions. And so for us, that's really what it's about. And as long as you're doing that in the community, you can grow at your own pace, but you got to be growing. As soon as you stay stagnant, that's the problem.
We're having a chat with Nadeem Naithoo, the founder of TKS, a school for high school kids that tries to have them become better versions of themselves. And it's fascinating. I've been there. He achieves it. We're going to take a break for messages and stay with us, please. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We're chatting tonight with Nadeem Naithoo, who is one of the founders of TKS, a school for kids, high school kids, after school that tries to teach them to be a better version of themselves. Nadeem, give us some case studies, if you could, examples of some of your students and what they've done.
So this is my favorite part, and I could talk about it forever. And you're not going to believe me, but if anything, I'm under exaggerating. Okay. So students come into the program not having any exposure, not really knowing about what any of these technologies are. Fast forward, here are some outcomes. So Ben, one of our students, he built a ring that can non-invasively measure blood glucose and cholesterol levels in real time without penetrating the skin. So it's like real-time monitoring of heart disease, diabetes. It's the global, it's like the holy grail of biometrics. And this 19-year-old kid figured it out. When he joined at 16, he didn't know anything about this stuff. And in fact, if you put your finger in his machine right now, you can get a more accurate blood glucose reading than traditional finger prick methods. How the heck did this kid do it? And he just raised $8 million, and he's doing really well for himself. And he's going to be the person that I think is going to dramatically change the world when it comes to preventative medicine. So he's one example. Ananya, she joined our program at 14, got really excited about genomics and gene editing. She then joined a lab, I think when she was late 14 or early 15, and she was able to cure muscular dystrophy in mice with her team, which is a genetic disease. We just got word a couple months ago that they're on human trials. Then she figured out a way to share genomics data using a platform called the blockchain. So if you're familiar with Bitcoin or Ethereum, people who are listening to this, the blockchain is the underlying technology for that. And it can be used for sharing information, not just digital currency. So she did that, ended up doing very well, solved an important problem, and then became a brain-computer interface developer. So she's figured out a way to control prosthetic limbs with her mind, electric cars, music, has been working with IBM, leading a team. Oh, by the way, she's still 17, right? So this is 3 years of going into the program. We have a student who pretty much pioneered the field of quantum machine learning. And if you don't know what that is, that's totally normal because this field doesn't really exist yet. And he got to work at one of the top quantum computing companies in the world full time at the same level of graduate students, because the CEO, Brigetti, calls him and says, hey, come work with us. You can always go back to school, but we really need you working on some of these tough problems. So there's tons more examples like these, but this is the level that our students are getting to. And that's something that I didn't expect to happen when I started TKS. I thought it was going to be when students are, maybe 22, 25, they were going to start solving really hard problems. They're doing it even before they go to university, which is pretty awesome to think about.
So why is your school so unbelievably successful and regular education fails?
Okay, a couple different things. We want to completely rethink the way young people learn and develop from every aspect. So if you think about the curriculum, we evolve the curriculum every year and we build it 2 weeks in advance. So it's not like we're teaching the same curriculum a year in advance or 5 years in advance. Our artificial intelligence session was completely different last year than it was this year because the field changed so much. Quantum was completely different. Nanotech and human longevity was completely different. So that's the first thing. The content, we're always changing. We very much have a growth mindset around that. The second is the people who are in front of the room. They're not teachers. They're people who are former founders. They've worked at top tech companies, influential roles at startups, venture capital, consulting. These are people that have worked on really hard problems and have dedicated their full time towards coaching and training these young people. So the advice and guidance that you get is really incredible. And then the environment that these students are in, they're in, whenever we meet for the sessions, we work out of top tech company offices. You almost feel like you're in Narnia when you walk in, and that's really empowering for the students. So that's a couple pieces there, but the mindset is the most important. So you teach someone the skills, you make them the smartest person in the world, but say you had no idea of what problems exist. It's virtually, if you're the smartest person in the world, but you don't know why climate change is happening, it's virtually impossible for you to leave everything to solve that problem. That's one thing. The second is risk profile. Say you're the smartest person in the world, but you got to take a certain level of risk to be able to tackle a problem, and you have a very low risk profile, you're not going to do it. You got to have the ability to be unconventional and have the courage to do something else. And we're in an environment that provides the system of encouragement for people to follow a different path.
How do you teach courage?
So that's what I mean. I don't know if there's actually a surefire way to teach courage, but I know what could help build courage is being in a system of encouragement. So I'll give you an example. Ananya, the woman who I talked about, who's building or who cured muscular dystrophy in mice with their team. She spoke at a conference called Web Summit. There's like 50,000 people that attend that conference. She was speaking in front of thousands. She was probably the youngest one in history to speak at that conference on that stage. She posted a picture of herself on Instagram, went back to school. People made fun of her. She deleted, and she goes to a really well-known private school, but she got bullied for it. And it's very academic, but she still got bullied for it. Then she came to TKS. And as soon as she walked in the room, people were like, oh my God, I was live streaming it. You know, I stayed up till 3 a.m. That was awesome. Holy cow. Like, tell me about your experience. And she's like, oh, this is awesome. This makes me want to do more. Whereas imagine every single time you did stuff like that, but people were just beating you down. Unless you have this natural courage or this quote unquote zero F's given mentality, it's very difficult to just continue doing that. And so my hypothesis is that there's a lot of people in the world who have the potential to achieve really awesome things, but because everybody around them is telling them not to do something or they think something's wrong, they end up not doing it, which I think is a problem.
So is there something wrong with our typical school system that dampens people's expectations and hopes and dreams?
I don't even know if it's just the school system. I think it's society in general. And I'll give you an example. So I talked about risk profile, right? I don't know if people fully understand the difference between risk and recklessness. And I think a lot of people, when they look at people taking a risk, society in general, they think it's reckless. So what's the difference? Okay, say you wanted to go skydiving and you wanted to jump out of a plane without a parachute. That's reckless. Why? Because there's no upside, right? Recklessness is doing something when there's no upside. Risk should be, yes, there's a downside, but there is a proportional upside. And what I find is that society, more often than not, doesn't understand what that upside is, whereas the person who wants to take the risk truly understands. So startup founders, as an example, I think they really understand the upside, whether it's monetary, whether it's the impact that they can have on the world, but a lot of people view it as reckless. And so how can we get to a point in society, and maybe it's not just in general, because maybe most people don't need to take this approach, but in certain environments where the default is, let's assume you're taking a risk and work backwards to see if it's reckless versus assuming it's reckless and prove to me that it's a risk, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. But what you're talking about is entrepreneurship. It's courage, and you know, I love your line that courage comes from encouragement. But where does entrepreneurship come from? Because that's often thought of as something people do on their own.
Yeah, I think there's a bunch of different reasons for why. So to be an entrepreneur, firstly, what you need is a relentless desire to achieve something. And for some people, the motivation is different. Because so when I talk to VCs as an example, especially early stage, and VC stands for venture capital. So they invest in startups and entrepreneurs to grow the companies. What they pretty much say is the number one quality that we look for is the entrepreneur willing to drag themselves through 5 years of broken glass before they come out on the other side, right? And what makes someone want to do that? Like oftentimes these journeys aren't fun. There's a lot of pressure. You have other people's money. You have employees that you're responsible for their livelihood. Why? Well, there's some people that are driven by just manifesting something in the world that wouldn't have existed because of them. They're creators. Some people are driven by money. Some people are driven by curiosity. Like, I just gotta know. I just gotta see what happens. And I think most of those are inventors. And so I think there's different things that drive people, but what you need without a doubt is a really harsh emotional driving factor to get you through that. Because if you're thinking about it logically, you should never do it, right? And I think that's sort of where it comes from.
So do you teach the kids this, or do you give them your philosophy, or is this something they just absorb over time?
No, I think, so let's talk about having an impact on the world. I don't think many people understand how much of an impact an individual can have. So that's the first step. You got to believe that you as an individual, so let's talk about 5G internet. It's going to completely transform the world, right? It's 1,000 times faster virtually than the internet that we have today, 500 to 1,000 times faster. It's going to have implications for self-driving cars, satellites, space travel, all this stuff. It's not magic. It doesn't just poof, right? It's people working on this technology, and it's it's a handful of people in the world who are making this happen, right? Elon Musk, without SpaceX, there would probably be a far less chances of civilization to be able to colonize Mars. So a single, and he probably accelerated electric vehicle adoption by 30 to 50 years. So if you thought it was inevitable, he definitely accelerated that. So the first thing that you got to train these kids is understanding the power of an individual. Then the second thing that you got to do is now they're like, okay, I can do something. The second thing you got to teach them is what is the thing? Most people don't actually get a really good, so at TKS we say you should have two priorities. If you take away anything, take away two priorities. The first is get a better understanding of yourself. The second is get a better understanding of the world. Once you do these two things, you'll be able to hack life. And so how can we train them to get a deep understanding of problems? Because once they have a deep understanding of a particular problem, then it's broken down in a manageable enough chunk where they're like, yes, I can actually address this. If you talk about climate change, who's going to address climate change? It's such a big, hairy thing to say. What is that even? But if you break it down to energy storage density, we need to figure out a way to make batteries better. And let's crack this energy storage density. And why are batteries so bad right now? Okay, let's figure it out. So then, so I think it's thinking, it's believing that you can do it, and then understanding the thing to do. I think those two pieces are really, really important.
You also said that you have to understand themselves. How do you get them to understand themselves?
I think you have to, so at like TKS, for example, we do mindfulness training, and sometimes we'll start off sessions with meditation. After every session, we have a debrief or an introspection time. That's really important because imagine writing an essay on Microsoft Word, but forgetting to press save. So that's what I think we do very often is we'll have all these awesome experiences. We'll live through things. We'll work on hard problems, but we won't stop to think, okay, what worked well? What didn't work well? What made me happy? What aligned to my values? All those things. And like ask yourself some of those tough questions and really think about it and evolve some of these answers. So for example, I mean, people might have heard the phrase, you're the average of the 5 people around you. Okay, so you can hear that and you can know it, but how many people stop to reflect, oh, who are the 5 people around me? What are their values and what is their influence on me? And then on top of that, does that align with mine? And do I want to make a change? I think very few people ask themselves these questions, even if they know that reality. And so how can we act as a forcing function to ask the right questions so that they can even think about this stuff in the first place? I think it's unrealistic to expect young people to think about these things by themselves. And so we really want to be the platform where they can do that and provide that intention for them.
You seem like an incredibly brilliant gentleman, but you look young. How did you get so wise?
I don't know how to answer that question. For me, it really is, I think, going back to my mental model on the world, which is how can you just be interesting? And for me, I feel like I've lived maybe 4 lifetimes already in terms of the people that I've met, the countries that I've traveled to, the problems that I've worked on. I mean, like, for example, you could live 20 years doing the same thing, and so you're not getting additional data points. And so when I think about wisdom, what you just said, well, how can we define wisdom? To me, the definition of wisdom, which you won't find in the dictionary, is the practical implication of knowledge plus experiences. The practical
implication of knowledge plus experiences.
Yes. So here's what you need to do. You can either train the practical piece. So this is what I call intention to action. I actually don't think it's wisdom if it's just stuck in your head. Like you really got to demonstrate the wisdom for it to be wisdom. So you might know all these things, but how can you start applying it? So that's the piece you can train. The implication. So asking yourself, so what, right? Whenever you get data points, these experiences plus knowledge, training that aspect of it, and then getting those knowledge plus experiences. And I think if you're intentional about training those 3 things, which I definitely wasn't, so I think I was lucky with my parents and maybe just this mental model that I had, and I didn't really have a lot of insecurity growing up. But I really think if people try and train those 3 things, this is my initial hypothesis, maybe it'll change, maybe wisdom is something completely different, but I think that really helps. And then it goes back to just getting a better understanding of yourself and a better understanding of the world, and a true understanding, not what you're reading, but you got to experience it. Like when I was working in all these developing countries, you see what the world is. North America is not the reality. North America is the bubble. Like let's take North American population between Canada and the US. There's 400 million people. You have Western Europe, that's 1 billion people. Japan, 100 million people. Australia, negligible. But there are 8 billion people in the world. So everybody outside of the countries in the regions that I said is not an energy rich, health rich, or education rich environment. We are very lucky. And if you think about humans, 500 years ago, we didn't have technology. We didn't have the internet. We weren't living in fancy apartments. We were milking cows and doing our duty. And if you ask yourself, is it possible for them to be just as happy as we were today? I think it's completely arrogant to say no. Like what, you needed technology? You needed to live very comfortably in North America to be happy? Of course not. And so how can we build a lot of those things that transcend the time that we're living, but that really just align with us as humans and our human condition, like what we're built for? Maybe this is getting too philosophical, but I think this is just what's really important for people to think about. Just get outside this rat race, get outside the structure that we're in, and just be like, we are humans living. What makes me, my biological meat sack, happy? It's not jobs from corporations didn't exist 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago. Like it was you doing your own thing to survive. And so like, were people laughing then? Yes. Were people happy then? Yes. Were people still having families and meaningful relationships? Yes. And so taking a step out of it once in a while, I think is important.
We're chatting with Nadeem Naithoo, founder of TKS, a school for kids after school. We're going to take a break. Stay with us for a little bit of a wrap up. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We're chatting about kids and how to motivate them. And TKS, a school that Nadeem Naithoo has co-founded with his brother that I've visited, and he does a great job. And if you listen to this show, you'll get a sense that he's done a great job. Nadeem, you were talking about getting out of the rat race. Do you think COVID-19 and self-isolation, social isolation, stay at home has allowed people to do that and think about that a little bit?
Definitely. I think it was a huge forcing function to get people to rethink what their priorities are. Unfortunately, in some circumstances, it took people losing their jobs to do that, but hopefully there is a silver lining in that. I mean, again, that is my hope that it's the case. But the reason why I think that's true is because I don't think people spend enough time thinking nowadays. And let me tell you what I mean by that. So I actually don't think a lot of people spend enough time doing or enough time thinking. Well, what else does that leave? In my opinion, it's just riding the wave, waking up and going through the motion. There's no active doing or active thinking. And young people in particular are victims of this because, again, when I was growing up, we didn't have a lot of technology, and I make myself sound dated and whatever, but I'm still fairly young. I'm 29 years old. But these students nowadays, they have Instagram, they have Netflix, they have speakers when they go in the shower, they can listen to music, they can take their phones in the shower because we have, waterproof phones now. And so if you ask young people how much time they actually have to think in a day, it's minutes, if that, because you're always distracting, you're always consuming, you're always looking at stuff. And I think being at home and having the ability to be bored is actually a good thing because it forces you to think, it forces you to introspect, even if you weren't in those environments, because you can't help but do that. And even if it was a result of a negative situation, I still think that there is a way to find silver lining in it. So to your point, I definitely think so.
So tell us about your school. I've visited you in Toronto. You've got schools elsewhere. I presume you've gone online with COVID-19. What are your expansion plans?
So currently we're in Toronto, Ottawa, New York, Boston, Ottawa, Las Vegas, Vancouver, and LA. So those where our physical programs are. And then we also have a TKS virtual program for students all over the world to be able to participate. And we've designed it, in my opinion, the teams work super hard to emulate the in-person experience as much as possible. Of course, there are things that you can't do online that you can do in person, but there's also a lot of things you can do online that you can't do in person, which is really exciting. So the program starts in September, goes till June. Applications are opening right now. Actually, they're closing June 30th. So if you know any young people between the ages of 13 to 18, anywhere in the world, I mentioned our existing cities, but even TKS Online, go to www.tks.world. So that's TKS, the letters, .world, and have them apply.
And what do they have to do with this application? What type of questions? Do you ask for marks? Do you ask for SATs?
Nope. No, we ask for none of that. It's, they're questions like, teach me about something you're interested in, or what is a company that is currently changing the world or innovating on an industry? Who is your role model? Why do you want to be in TKS? What separates you from other people? What life do you want to avoid for yourself in the future? It's these types of questions, really getting a sense of how you think. And then the interview process is just making sure that you're doing it for the right reasons, right? If you're doing this to get into a better university, if you're doing it to, this is what the kids say, quote unquote, resume pad, don't come to TKS. It really is, it does have to be for you to become the best version of yourself. And our philosophy is, as long as we do that and we train the right things, whatever you want will come, right? So don't focus on the outcome, focus on the process.
I think you're doing an amazing job. How can we help you?
I would say just spread the word about TKS. I think the biggest shame for me is that, we built TKS for people to solve really important problems in the world. And the biggest shame for me is if there's someone out there that could be the next Elon Musk. And trust me, you don't know who that person is. So if you think that your son or daughter or somebody else absolutely would not be for the right fit for this, you're probably wrong. Okay. I don't think anybody is a good job or does a good job right now in the world identifying potential. Just share with them, because who knows, they could be the person that completely transformed the world in the future if they only had the right environment to do that. So spread the word, check out the website, just encourage people to apply. And that's really all I ask. And hopefully we can contribute a lot to the world in the next couple of years.
Nadeem Naithoo, founder of TKS, thanks so much for joining us. We're going to take one final break. I'm going to come back with some final concluding comments. Stay with us. Well, thanks again for joining us on the Brian Crombie Radio Hour, Saga 960. You know what? This is just a part-time fun gig for me in interviewing people and putting it online and on the radio and doing the video cast. But I meet, because of it, some absolutely fascinating people. And Nadeem, 29 years old, so incredibly wise with such great ideas. And he's really changing the lives of some of his kids, some of the students that go to his school in numerous different cities around the world, as you heard in his interview. And you know what? It comes down to a couple of simple things. Setting forward this intention that I actually want to be the best version of myself. Having this encouragement from others that gives you the courage to take risks. Knowing the difference between risk and recklessness. And then going out and learning and believing that you can actually be a force for change in the world. I think those are wonderful things to be teaching our kids. And so I congratulate Nadeem. I congratulate TKS. I've been involved in some other organizations. One's called Ideal Me here in Mississauga, and other things I do, a talk called Community in the Power Co. There's numerous different people out there that are trying to motivate children, motivate kids to be the best version of themselves. I ended up having this one mental health expert that said that the key to success in life is falling in love with the future version of yourself, which is sort of like this Nadine's comment about becoming the best version of yourself. I love that. Falling in love with the future vision of yourself. So let's get out and motivate some kids to change the world. Thanks for joining us tonight. Good night.